There is a country in the heart of Europe that has never been bombed, never been colonized, and never fought a major war in over 200 years. It has no coastline, no oil, no vast farmlands, no rare minerals worth mentioning, and yet it is one of the wealthiest nations on earth. Its cities are immaculate. Its trains run on time. Its citizens enjoy one of the highest standards of living anywhere in the world. And for generations, the world has looked at Switzerland and nodded with admiration, assuming that this is what good governance and hard work look like. But if you pull back the curtain just a little, the story becomes far more complicated and far more disturbing. Switzerland did not get rich by accident. It got rich by making a very deliberate choice over and over again across centuries to be the place where money goes when it does not want to be found. That is the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath the chocolate and the skiing and the clean mountain air. Switzerland built its prosperity on secrecy, and secrecy is only valuable to people who have something to hide. Before we dive in, a quick but important update. YouTube has shut down monetization for this channel. We are keeping the lights on. That's why we have launched on Rumble, Facebook, Spotify, and Patreon. If you enjoy this content, please pause right now and follow us on those platforms using the links in the pinned comment. We may eventually stop posting here entirely, so make the move with us today. Now, let's get back to the video. To understand how this happened, you have to go back further than most people expect. The Swiss banking system did not begin with shady offshore accounts in the 20th century. It began in the 17th and 18th centuries when Geneva and Zurich emerged as financial centers for European aristocrats and monarchs who needed to store wealth away from their own governments. French kings kept accounts in Geneva. German nobles parked fortunes in Zurich. Even then, the Swiss understood something that would define their entire economic model for centuries to come. Discretion was a product. Silence was something you could sell. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Switzerland had already established itself as the bank of choice for Europe's elite. And when the revolution came and aristocrats started losing their heads, the money that survived did so largely because it had already crossed into Swiss territory. The revolutionary government tried to claw it back. They failed. The Swiss kept the money and kept their mouths shut. That was the deal, and it worked beautifully for everyone involved except perhaps the French people who had been bled dry by those same aristocrats. But the moment that truly transformed Switzerland into the global capital of financial secrecy came in 1934. And the timing is worth paying attention to. That year, the Swiss government passed the Federal Banking Act, which made it a criminal offense, a literal crime punishable by imprisonment for any Swiss banker to disclose information about a client's account to a foreign government or authority. This was presented to the world as a measure to protect ordinary depositors from the rising threat of Nazi Germany, which was pressuring Swiss banks to hand over the accounts of German Jewish citizens so the regime could confiscate their assets. And that part is true. The Nazis were doing exactly that. But here is what the history books tend to gloss over. The bank secrecy law did not only protect Jewish families from Nazi persecution. It protected everyone equally, including the Nazis themselves. In the years that followed, as the Second World War consumed Europe, both sides of the conflict used Swiss banks. Allied governments used them. The Nazi regime used them. Corporations supplying weapons to Germany used them. And through it all, Switzerland remained officially neutral. Its banks quietly processing transactions from every direction, charging modest fees for the privilege of looking the other way. After the war ended and the world tried to rebuild, investigators began piecing together what had actually moved through Swiss accounts during the conflict. What they found was staggering. Gold looted from occupied countries had passed through Swiss institutions. Artwork stolen from Jewish families had been financed through Swiss channels. The personal fortunes of Nazi officials had been quietly parked in numbered accounts that no one was legally permitted to discuss. Switzerland spent decades insisting it had been a neutral party simply trying to survive between powerful enemies. What the evidence actually showed was a financial system that had profited handsomely from the worst atrocities of the 20th century. The Swiss government eventually acknowledged some of this decades later under enormous international pressure. A report commissioned in the late 1990s by a panel of independent historians concluded that Swiss banks had held on to hundreds of millions of dollars in dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims and had actively resisted returning those funds to survivors or their families. The banks eventually paid a settlement of around $1.25 billion in 1998. But by that point, the Swiss banking system had been operating profitably for over 60 years on the back of that war-era secrecy. And $1.25 billion was a fraction of what had moved through those accounts. Now, you might think that after all of this came to light, Switzerland would have fundamentally changed its model. And in some ways, it did, but not nearly as much as the official statement suggested. Because by the time the Holocaust reckoning happened, Switzerland had already diversified its secrecy business far beyond Europe. It had become the destination of choice for an entirely new generation of clients with money they did not want traced. Through the second half of the 20th century, Swiss banks became the preferred storage facility for dictators, oligarchs, corrupt politicians, and organized crime networks from every corner of the globe. Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines accumulated a personal fortune estimated at anywhere between 5 and 10 billion during his decades in power. Much of it looted directly from the Philippine state treasury. A significant portion of that money ended up in Swiss accounts. After Marcos fled the country in 1986, the Philippine government spent years trying to recover what had been stolen. The Swiss legal process was slow, cooperative, only up to a point, and the full amount was never retrieved. Mobutu Seko of the Democratic Republic of Congo, then called Zaire, ruled his country for over 30 years, while his people lived in poverty so severe that the average citizen had less access to basic services at the end of his reign than at the beginning. Nabu personally accumulated a fortune estimated at around $5 billion siphoned from Congo's vast mineral wealth. Swiss banks held a substantial portion of it. The Swiss government eventually froze some of those assets after Mobutu fell from power. But the process of returning the money to the Congolese people was tangled in legal proceedings for years. The pattern repeated itself with almost mechanical regularity. A dictator loots his country. The money flows into Switzerland. The regime eventually collapses or the dictator dies. The victim country tries to reclaim its stolen wealth. Switzerland engages in a slow legal dance that returns some funds, retains others, and charges fees throughout the process. Meanwhile, the reputation of Swiss banking as a secure and discreet destination is actually reinforced, not damaged, because even when things go wrong for a client, the Swiss have demonstrated that they will hold the money and make retrieval as difficult as possible. That is not a bug in the system. That is the feature. And it was not only political corruption flowing into Switzerland. The country became deeply embedded in the infrastructure of global tax evasion, which is a polite term for wealthy individuals and corporations, hiding money from their own governments to avoid paying taxes that their fellow citizens could not avoid. Swiss private banks offered accounts to wealthy Europeans, Americans, and anyone else who could meet the minimum deposit requirements. And in exchange, they offered something almost magical in its simplicity. The money sat there, earned interest, grew quietly, and no government anywhere in the world was told it existed. For much of the 20th century, this was not even particularly illegal from the Swiss perspective. Switzerland drew a sharp distinction between tax evasion, which it did not consider a crime, and tax fraud, which it did. This distinction sounds technical, but it had enormous practical consequences. If you simply failed to declare a Swiss account to your home government, Switzerland would not help your government find out about it. Your home country might consider that tax evasion and prosecute you. Switzerland considered it a civil matter, not a criminal one, and therefore not something that triggered any obligation to cooperate with foreign authorities. This legal architecture was not an accident. It was a deliberate policy choice that made Switzerland uniquely attractive to wealthy people everywhere who wanted to shelter income from taxation. Economists who have studied the flows of hidden wealth estimate that at the peak of Swiss banking secrecy, somewhere between $1 and $2 trillion in assets belonging to non-Swiss citizens was sitting in Swiss accounts. Much of it undeclared to any tax authority anywhere. The tax revenue lost to governments around the world as a result runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars over decades. That is money that could have funded hospitals, schools, roads, and social programs. Instead, it sat quietly in Zurich and Geneva, generating fees for Swiss institutions. The pressure on Switzerland to dismantle the system eventually became overwhelming. After the 2008 financial crisis, when governments around the world were desperate for revenue and increasingly furious at offshore tax havens, the United States took direct aim at Swiss banking secrecy. The case of UBS, one of Switzerland's largest banks, became the moment everything changed. American investigators discovered that UBS had been systematically helping American citizens hide money from the IRS, with bankers traveling to the United States to recruit clients and advise them on how to structure accounts in ways that would evade detection. In 2009, UBS paid a fine of $780 million and handed over the names of over 4,000 American account holders, breaking Swiss banking secrecy in the most dramatic way since 1934. Other Swiss banks followed. Credit Suisse eventually paid a fine of $2.6 billion in 2014 after pleading guilty to helping Americans evade taxes. The Swiss government signed international agreements on automatic exchange of tax information. The era of total banking secrecy was officially declared over. Switzerland was now, at least in theory, a cooperative member of the international financial transparency system. But here is where things get interesting. Even as Switzerland moved toward formal transparency, the core of its financial appeal did not disappear. It evolved. The Swiss financial sector had spent centuries developing expertise in wealth management, legal structuring, estate planning, and asset protection that went far beyond simply hiding money in a numbered account. Switzerland remained one of the world's leading destinations for what is politely called private banking, which is the business of managing large fortunes for very wealthy clients using sophisticated legal tools that reduce tax obligations without necessarily crossing any lines. The line between legal tax planning and aggressive tax avoidance is one that tax authorities and governments debate constantly. But the Swiss financial industry has been navigating that line with extraordinary skill for a very long time. The infrastructure of lawyers, accountants, trust companies, and financial advisors that grew up around Swiss banking secrecy did not simply close up shop when the secrecy laws changed. It adapted, and Switzerland, despite signing all the right international agreements, remained a top-tier destination for the world's largest private fortunes. There is also a dimension of this story that extends beyond banking into the physical geography of Swiss commerce. Switzerland is home to an extraordinary concentration of global commodity trading companies. A large share of the world's oil, metals, grain, and other raw commodities are traded through companies registered in Switzerland, particularly in the canton of Zug, which has some of the lowest corporate tax rates in Europe. These companies sit at the center of supply chains that extract resources from some of the poorest countries on Earth and sell them to the richest markets in the world. The profit from that trade is booked in Switzerland, where taxes are low and disclosure requirements are manageable. The countries where the resources actually come from often see very little of that profit. When you add all of this together, what you get is a picture that is quite different from the Switzerland of tourist brochures. You see a country that made a strategic decision centuries ago to monetize discretion, and that built an entire economic culture around that decision. It attracted the wealth of European aristocrats fleeing revolution, then the looted fortunes of a world war, then the stolen assets of post-colonial dictators, then the hidden accounts of wealthy tax evaders from every continent. And at each stage, the Swiss financial system grew richer, more sophisticated, and more deeply embedded in the global infrastructure of wealth management. None of this means that every Swiss person is corrupt or that Switzerland has not done genuine good in the world. The country's humanitarian tradition through the Red Cross and its role in international diplomacy is real. Swiss manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, and precision engineering are genuine industries built on real expertise. But the wealth that underwrites Swiss stability and prosperity cannot be cleanly separated from the financial history that built it. The country that perfected the art of asking no questions about where money came from built a system that benefited its citizens enormously. The people who suffered were the ones whose money was stolen before it arrived. The African citizens whose public resources were looted by their leaders. The European families whose wartime savings disappeared into numbered accounts. The ordinary taxpayers in country after country who paid more because someone wealthier paid nothing. Switzerland did not invent corruption or greed. It simply made itself the most convenient place in the world to park the proceeds. And for that service, rendered quietly and professionally across centuries, it was paid extremely well. The mountains are beautiful. The watches are precise. The banks kept their secrets for a very long time. And that is how Switzerland got rich. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.